And we're back with former Assistant Secretary of Defense and President of the Center for Security Policy, Frank, live from D.C. this morning. All right, Frank, so you were on our air earlier talking about the Fort Hood shootings, and then these alerts started coming in that Eric Holder, the Attorney General of the United States, will make the announcement later today that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is coming to New York City. Do you find anything about the timing of this interesting, or am I being too cynical?
Well, I don't know about the timing. All I can tell you is about the quality of the decision. I think this is a disaster. What the president says is going to be exacting justice, I think is going to be anything but, because what will happen the moment Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his co-conspirators or fellow travelers arrive in the United States is they will be imbued with a host of constitutional rights that is almost unimaginable for most Americans who are going to be giving to our enemies, people sworn to our destruction. They will also be immediately lawyered up with some of the best lawyers in the country who will be working to apply those rights in ways that may well get them sprung, because we're going to find that suddenly some of the techniques that were used to extract information from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, for example, waterboarding, constitutes torture in the view of judges, or otherwise there will be efforts made to spring these guys.
Do you really think it is possible that they might get off, they might walk?
Yeah, I think Andy McCarthy, the National Review Online, a former prosecutor, put it very well the other day. He said the biggest problem with this kind of practice is not that these guys are going to get, released from prison through their own violent means, but because they'll walk out. Because some judge says, hey, or the government says, hey, we can't try them in courts in the United States. That's why keeping them in Guantanamo Bay, I think, is absolutely appropriate.
Well, you know what he said when he was arrested, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. He said, well, I'm not going to say anything until I get to New York City and get a lawyer. They said, I don't think so, because he thought it was going to be like the blind sheikh. And he was delayed. It was delayed for 6-7 years, but he's actually going to get his day in court. And can you imagine? Remember all those scenes of the blind sheikh walking into Manhattan and all the screams and the circus that the Zacarias Moussaoui case was, and he admitted he was guilty. Can you imagine here where New York City is still a terror target, and then you bring the mastermind of 9/11 here? It's impossible to put that in perspective, I think.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. He'll be a rock star in the prison system. And one of the things that we've been learning about the sort of influence operations and other mechanics of what's been happening in our country by those who adhere, as I talked about earlier, to Sharia, is they use our prisons as incubators for people to their recruiting to jihad.
Yep.
Having a guy like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed anywhere in the system, I think, will only enhance that effort and make this a much more dangerous country than it is today.
You know what, Frank, that's such an excellent point. I had not even thought about that. But here, my mind's spinning this morning because I'm thinking about that Greg Craig is going to resign today as the top lawyer because of the wrangling over Gitmo. The very first resolution that President Obama signed was to close Gitmo. That has not happened. And now, on the heels of the president being half the world away, you have his Attorney General making the announcement that these 5 characters are coming to the United States of America.
Yeah. Well, look, this wasn't just Eric Holder's decision alone. You can bet that this was fully coordinated with the White House. And I think Greg Craig is involved in what is a debacle. The president's decision was ill-advised. The furtherance of it, which is frankly part of what they're doing by bringing KSM here, is ill-advised, and the repercussions of it are going to be very long-lasting. Against the backdrop of what we saw at Fort Hood, I think most Americans are saying, what are we doing here? Who's in charge? Is anybody paying attention to the gravity of what these adherent types have in mind for us? And I'm afraid the answer at the moment is not. So clearly, yes.
Right. Yeah, and Frank, you mentioned Fort Hood. The news this morning, apparently the alleged shooter, this Nidal Hassan, had printed up some business cards he kept in his desk in his apartment that said SOA, which means Soldier of Allah, as you can see right there, right under his name. And then, okay, so you've got the story we were just talking about, how you think there's a possibility these fellows like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed may actually walk, and then you look at how the government charged him yesterday, Mr. Hassan, with 13 counts of capital murder. There's a possibility he might not serve the ultimate justice, because the last time the military, he's up for the death penalty, that's a potential, but the last time the military actually executed anybody was 1961.
Right. But why isn't the guy being charged with terrorism?
Yeah, why?
Why isn't this guy being considered a terrorist in furtherance, again, of this Sharia agenda? This is what's really worrying. And again, it's so important that the public understand that why they can't figure this out is because I believe in ways that are quite comprehensive, we have been subjected in this country, our government, our prisons, our military, other institutions, to a sort of influence operation that says, hey, you can't even talk about this.
Right.
You can't even understand the true gravity of it, because that will cause you to be considered a racist, a bigot, an Islamophobe. It'll cost you your career in government. It'll jeopardize, your livelihood. We have got to be clear that we're up against enemies who are determined to destroy us. They are using sophisticated means inside our country, and that's part of why I think we've gotten this so badly wrong to this point, is we haven't understood that.
Do you remember, Frank,
we haven't come to grips with it.
Do you remember a couple of months ago, we were going to call it the war on terror anymore?
Yeah,
we were going to call
we're not.
But what were we going to call it? We weren't going to call it domestic anything. We were going to call it overseas contingency operations. And now we've got this Fort Hood situation. And my question to you this morning is, how pervasive do you think this problem is? We know how pervasive it is outside of the military. In New York City alone, they've quashed 9 major attacks since 9/11. But how pervasive do you think this could be inside our military?
I think it's a serious problem inside the military because, among other influence operations, has been the recruitment, the training, the certification of chaplains by a front, or several fronts actually, of the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization whose mission is to destroy us from within. You've got some of those chaplains in our military, and by the way, a Saudi-funded influence operation as well, aimed at converting Americans in the military to the Muslim faith according to Sharia. That's a potentially huge problem. Not all Muslims, needless to say, certainly not all of them in the uniforms of our country, but some, at the very least, are, I think, probably aligned with Major Hassan and with the larger program of which he was a part.
Frank Gaffney, there's so much breaking news, and it's all in your expertise. Thanks so much for staying around for us.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, 12 minutes.